Hi everybody, I'm Butch Stearns, the Chief Content Officer here at the Pulse Network, and alongside for CEO Corner is the CEO of the Pulse Network, Stephen Saber. Stephen, today's show is very interesting because we're going to talk about the evolution of IT into the C-suite. We're going to talk about the role of IT, and we're going to talk about it as an integral part of a business model, but we're also going to talk about the notion of bridging business and technology together. And we have the perfect guest to do this, I think. So let's talk about that a little bit in general.
So IT used to be the appendage. It was basically, you used it for infrastructure, you used it to sort of build the core parts of your business, but it was never, it's moved into being a very strategic part of what's going on. If you think about marketing, marketing is all about IT. If you think about sales, sales really is all reliant on how your IT supports it. If you think about communication, it's all about IT. If you think about operations and efficiency, again, it's all about IT. What's happened is that IT has begun from being these large, ginormous application builds and developments that were sort of put off to the side, and now all of a sudden they become very much a part of what goes on inside the C-suite. They're very much parts of discussions that CEOs are having every day, because now they have to be IT savvy in order to be successful, because it's become such an integral part of what they're doing.
So our guest who's about to come on is Kevin Howard Goldberg. He's a principal and founder of Imagistic, a company that's in Southern California, has been around since 1997. Before we bring Kevin in, from a CEO's perspective, in a very general sense, the silo that used to be IT, when you talk about marketing, sales, IT, it seems to me, and confirm or deny this for me, that when you talk about IT now, in 2012 and beyond, it's more vital than ever that they're not in a silo, that they're not only knowing what's going on in all those other departments, but they're integral to what's going on in all those other departments.
Well, they're a part of everything now, and not only that, but it's not, they're no longer they're us. And that's really what's happened, is that the whole language and the body language has changed, because it used to be, oh my goodness, I don't want to hear, I don't understand it. You're talking a language I can't get. And now all of a sudden, that's what's making it strategic. That's what's making you smarter as a company. That's what's making you more efficient. The other day we talked about being more agile as a business. That's what's giving you the ability to have more agility inside your organization.
I was bringing our guest for this edition of CEO Corner. His name is Kevin Howard Goldberg. He is the president of Imagistic.com. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. How are you?
You're out in Southern California. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about Imagistic.
My background, before I started Imagistic, I went to the Wharton School of Business. I started to get a master's in computer science at UCLA, and then I got a job programming video games. So put the master's aside, but I actually have a tremendous amount of programming experience. Imagistic was started 15 years ago with the intention of bridging business and technology. What we do well is understand clients' business needs, understand return on investment, and from that point, we work towards building the application.
So when you talk about the notion of bridging business and technology, is that a mindset? Is that more of a methodology? And with you as a technology guy by nature of what you've done, how do you add into that? How do you lead that as the CEO within your organization and with your clients?
Interesting. Yeah, it is a little bit of both. Obviously, my background is perfect for bridging that gap with a business and tech background. And what we find typically is that a lot of development houses, a lot of software builds are very tech focused, and they're not thinking about the business. So part of our methodology in all the projects that we engage in is to focus our discovery process in the business first. It's not about scope, it's not about features, it's about understanding the business needs that are driving those features. And then we use that throughout the entire engagement, always checking back. So there's a check and balance process that we use to make sure that business and technology are always in sync.
So Kevin, let's talk. The company was founded in '97, as we see, but a lot's changed since then, right? I mean, my background was IT services back in the day. And if I think about what we did back then and what we have to do now, it's totally different. The business model's changed. The whole acceptance of what we do has changed. Talk about that evolution and how it's impacted how you will go about projects with people you work with.
Well, it's interesting, and we talk about that actually in the organization. I talk about it with my staff. The change has had a number of different impacts. First, what we have is we have clients who are more technically savvy, and that yields a client that unfortunately can be a little bit dangerous because they understand enough to be dangerous, but they don't understand the process in the end unless they've done the build a number of times. But typically, what we need to do is we need to disengage our clients from this knowledge, again, focusing on the business, the underlying business requirements. So that's one of the things we talk about. The other thing that I find in terms of this shift is that everybody has a tech project. You know, everybody in the organization has something that they need from technology. And so we're finding clients in all the different areas of business, whether it's sales and marketing, traditional marketing or online, whether you're talking about CRM or content management systems, e-commerce, everybody is slowly but surely realizing that technology is a foundation for what they need to do for the business.
So you deal with a lot of really interesting organizations. Talk about, if you're giving 3 to 5 pieces of advice to a CEO of ways to think differently about how technology is implemented in an organization, and more importantly, how do you work with these guys? Because it used to be one of those, I don't want to work with them. I don't want to have to understand what it is they're saying. What are you saying now to a C-level executive or a senior level executive, business executive, who now is managing the IT process as a part of what they're doing? What are the pointers you give them in terms of how best to deal with you or your organization or any organization that's responsible for the development and implementation of the systems?
Okay. The first thing that I would say is make sure that you realize that there's a new language, there's a new nomenclature that you're going to need to understand. You, as the C-level person, need to be able to communicate your vision to other people. And I know that goes without saying, but I think sometimes at the C-level we get a little caught up in the notion that, well, we're the chief of this, and so somebody has to learn what I'm saying. I find that gets in the way, oftentimes, of clear communication. So take a moment to go online. There's tons of resources, tons of courses, whatever it is, but learn the key nomenclature of the project or process that you're embarking on. The second thing that I would say is remember that IT is no longer a silo. And I would recommend you bringing them into the fold earlier in the process and keeping them engaged throughout the discovery and analysis so that they are more fully aware and more fully vested in the process. Those are probably the two things that jump out at me that I think would be important.
So let's talk about nomenclature, because that changes a lot, right? The development strategies change, the development life cycles change, the processes change. But you're right, they need to speak the language that's now being incorporated in what there is that they're implementing and using. You use terminology that, people talk about agile development, for instance, as a new methodology. They're talking about, different types of platforms and solutions and pads and mobiles and everything. How best do you sort of become knowledgeable without being dangerous? Because on the one hand, if you try to sit down with a tech guy and you pretend you know the difference between an open source architecture and a .NET architecture, and you really don't know what you're talking about, you could find yourself in trouble. How do you tell them to understand enough, but then not sort of overcomplicate the situation? Don't try to solve the problem that's not your problem to solve.
Well, you said exactly what I was going to say, which is ultimately you need to be able to delegate. Don't try and learn enough so that you can solve the problem. It's not your job. Your job is to be the vision, to be the guide. Technology has been changing, and it will constantly change. So it's important to stay abreast of what's going on and what people are doing. At the same time, the implementation, such as you talked about, agile versus traditional waterfall, or whether it's open source or .NET, I don't think that the C-level people need to understand that. I don't think that's going to benefit really. What would be incumbent upon somebody at that level would be to say, when somebody in technology says, I think we're going to go agile on this, to be able to ask the question and say, well, what is agile? Oh, it's a production methodology. Great. Can you explain, why that's the right methodology? So ask the questions at that point. I don't think going in and understanding, what Scrum means is really going to help a C-level person.
Everyone, I'm Tyler Pybert of the Pulse Network, and thanks for tuning in to CEO Corner, one of our original programs that we produce right here in our own studios. If you want to learn more how you can produce your own original content, all you have to do is log on to thepulsenetwork.com and hit the Contact Us tab, and that way you can see exactly how you do that. I'm Tyler Pybert of the Pulse Network. Well, what's next now?
My name is Butch Stearns, Stephen Saber, the CEO of the Pulse Network. Kevin Howard Goldberg is our guest. He's the president of Imagistic. You guys both just used, and keeping in mind that our audience is, target audience is CEOs and C-level executives, the word dangerous, that the current CEO is dangerous, and you balanced it between the need to know, the need to speak the same language to get IT out of that silo, but as Kevin just said, not to be the one that necessarily solves the problem, to be the guide to do that. Talk a little bit more about that, Stephen. That's a balancing act, isn't it?
It's a scary one at that, because CEOs now are challenged to be smart about technology. You have to be in order to be successful. You can no longer ignore it. That's one of the things Kevin was saying. But you need to know enough, but you need to know when you don't need to go down there. You don't need to go down the path, and you need to know at what point can I hand it off to someone. It used to be that you would hand it off a lot further back in the life cycle. So you would sort of set a stage and let it go. Now all of a sudden you need to carry it further, and you need to be involved and engaged, but not too far down, because then all of a sudden you're making decisions that are dangerous. Kevin, you made the point of set the vision. And if I think back to projects I was involved in back in sort of the 96, 97 timeframe, like when you were launching, the vision was a lot simpler. You would sort of set a high-level goal, and then you'd let them run. I'm assuming when you say set the vision and be articulate about the vision right now, that you have a very different statement than you would have said 10, 15 years ago.
It's true. Obviously technology has changed dramatically, and its impact and need has changed dramatically. So as you guys were saying, the vision that a C-level exec needs to bring to the table needs to be broader and deeper. The understanding of the technology needs to be greater. One of the things that came up in my mind as you guys were talking was, everybody has a social media plan and strategy, or wants one if they don't. And what I would recommend to CEOs or other C-level execs at that time is make sure you have a Facebook account, make sure you have a Twitter account for yourself. Make sure you've looked at Pinterest, look at these, use these systems, understand them, so that you go in and you have a knowledge base from which to draw. You don't need to necessarily know what your strategy is going to be. That's what the marketing people are for. But if you've never used these applications, if you have kids, watch them use it, or your spouse, watch them use it, so you have clarity about the application and its possibilities. That's what you need to bring to the table, and that's what's changed a lot in terms of the discussions that CEOs and C-level execs are having.
So Kevin, let's talk about the other side of the equation, because we just saw on your description of your Twitter account that it talked about improving bottom line. And now you see a lot more where C-level executives are trying to measure results. And how do they go about doing it if they are trying to measure results? Because I've got to believe measurement and ROI is a lot bigger an issue now than it was before.
I don't know that it's bigger, but the beauty of technology is that it's more accessible.
Okay.
What we have, in traditional marketing, you put up a billboard, or you have an ad, or you have a TV spot, or whatever. And a lot of times it's hard to track that. Very hard to track that. Even if you have a customized URL, it was only, say the last 5 to 10 years where that actually was valid and usable. Nowadays, with any kind of marketing campaign, if you have, a customized URL and you can track what happens from the moment somebody hits that URL all the way through the process. You have your campaigns, they're coded. You have these landing pages, they're coded, and you can track somebody from campaign all the way through to lead, to sale. That's the kind of ROI that allows marketing efforts to be very clearly directed, analyzed, scrapped if they're working and not working, or doubled or tripled if they are. And that's an amazing part of technology today.
Kevin, let's go a little deeper into your notion of bridging business and technology. You have some fascinating clients that you work with. You've worked with GE Capital, educationally, universities like Boston University and UCLA, California Pizza Kitchen, the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. Christopher Reeve, of course, they do wonderful things on paralysis and things like that. Either talk about one of them in particular, or just in general, again, your methodology and your mindset in bridging business and technology. How do you go about it with a particular client or with all of your clients?
I think really I'm going to talk about it from a general perspective.
Okay.
And what we do is we start off the discovery process and put technology aside, intentionally and purposefully. And really, my project managers know that that's a foundational component. It's not about the technology. Technology does not drive the process. It's the business goals that drive the process. And so with any of our clients, what we start off with first is, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? How can it be measured? And what's the return that you'd like to see on this effort? So we have a foundation of business before we go to technology. And then as we go through and start discussing the scope and discussing the requirements, we keep pulling back to the business requirements and make sure that they're in sync. And when they're not, we bring it up and say, this scope item that we're talking about here doesn't fall in line with the requirements that you've set up from the business perspective. And it allows us to cross-check and checks and balances against what the ultimate goal is, which is we're all driving a business, whether you're a nonprofit such as Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, or you're a for-profit such as California Pizza Kitchen. The bottom line is the bottom line. You're doing it to generate enough capital to stay in business. In the case of a nonprofit, you're trying to serve people, but you need money to serve. And in the case of a business, obviously, that's one of the primary goals as well, obviously.
Well, what I heard you say, that makes sense to me, what we do here, Stephen, is we have a one sheet for every single client. And the four main things that are on there, number one on the list is, what problems do they have and how are we trying to help them solve those problems? And I got to tell you honestly, Kevin, I find myself going back to that one sheet every so often when I'm on a conference call, when I'm thinking about a project for a client, to make sure I'm reminding myself, to your point about the business, starting with the business principles, but starting with the problems you're trying to solve with a client. It sounds so basic, but you can get lost along the way, can't you?
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And people do all the time. And that's the key, is to have, your one sheet. And for us, it's not a one sheet, but it's the same foundational document and principles that drive the project the entire time.
So then how do you bridge that, though? Because you've got, if I'm CEO and I've got my IT guys, they're developers, they're programmers, they're techies, they're, I don't want to use any...
You say it with such disdain.
And that was me in the day, right? But that's
They're
what
so
they are.
vital to you, and you're talking
They're
down to
critical,
them.
but they play in that world. And now you're asking them to understand business and ROI. I mean, there's a language, just like the C-level guy needs to understand a nomenclature, there's a nomenclature and a language that the IT people need to understand as well, isn't there?
It's actually very true. I actually did a talk a number of years ago where it was called something like, how to get the budget that you want, something like that. And the idea was the exact same thing that you just said, which is the tech people need to take the time to learn the business nomenclature. Again, they don't have to run the business, they don't have to be doing the ROI calculations, but they need to understand what an ROI calculation is. So it does require both, absolutely. And in the cases where you don't have the tech team that understands the nomenclature, you don't have the C-suite team that understands the nomenclature, frankly, that's where a consultant can come in. Somebody like Imagistic or somebody else that can bridge that gap between the tech and the business and hold them accountable to each other.
And so let's ask the when question. When's the right time for someone like you to come on board and get involved? Is it, at what point in the life cycle, what point in the problem-solving issue does it make sense to bring an Imagistic into an organization to get involved in the conversation?
The truth is, it can be at any point in the process. What I will say is that you definitely want to bring somebody like us in before you hit the specifications process. So it can be in the blue sky phase, it can be in the initial budgeting or requirements analysis, but as soon as you start generating specifications that are going to be implemented, you really want to make sure that you have cross-checked the business needs and the tech needs.
So Kevin, for you, when's the ideal time for you to get involved? When would you prefer to get involved in this process with a client?
The preference is the very beginning. We love doing blue sky meetings. The benefit of us being in a blue sky meeting is we can bring an awareness of both sides to the table. So whether we're talking to C-suite people or we're talking to tech people, we have both knowledge bases, both nomenclatures, and we can bring that to the table to help make the blue skying more in line, more reasonable, more accessible, and ultimately more successful.
So Kevin, let's wrap up here with a couple of takeaways. You've talked about speaking the same language, the same nomenclature between business and IT. You've reinforced several times to us your philosophy with Imagistic, the notion of bridging business and technology by starting with business principles and always going back to that as your foundation. What are some of the takeaways for the CEO, for the C-level executive, when you're talking about this, I don't want to call it a holistic approach, but it's a we, it's an us approach, isn't it, Stephen,
Right,
as opposed to
them.
Right.
Right.
What are some of the main takeaways, Kevin?
Probably the most important thing is, it goes back to what you were saying early on in the discussion, which is 10, 15 years ago when Imagistic started, IT was siloed. IT was in a separate room. Projects were sort of, put on their desk and they were set off in motion. And there wasn't a connection between IT and the rest of the organization. And for me, we're still finding organizations that are like that there isn't a connection point between the business, whether it's marketing, sales, CEO, it doesn't matter. We're still finding companies that have that gap between tech and business. And to me, the takeaway is to eliminate the gap, to bridge that, to bring your CTO or whomever is managing your technology, to bring them into the process much earlier, to engage them and get them invested in the process so that they're part not only of your process in terms of the visioning and the specifications, but they're bringing that then into the development so it is unified in that way.
His name is Kevin Howard Goldberg. He is the president of Imagistic. They are in Southern California. They're in Westlake Village. You can find him at Imagistic.com. Also, Kevin, you're a teacher at times. You've also been an author, and you proudly told us before the show that if we Google XML, the book XML Visual Quick Start Guide, second edition, is the first thing to come up. Still?
If you hit Amazon, I don't know if it's Google. Google is probably fourth or fifth, but Amazon, it's number one.
How do you prefer that people reach out to you, through the website or through any of your social channels?
I have no preference. If you need to find me, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can go to our site, click the contact. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot.
Kevin Howard Goldberg from Imagistic. So, Stephen, let's talk about what we set up at the beginning of the show. The evolution of IT in the C-suite, the fact that it's changed over the years, but that IT is now, I think you said, a more integral part or different than it was years ago, correct?
It's part of the business now. It's integrated in everything you do, exactly. And that's the key thing. And I thought, what I found very interesting in this conversation was his 2 points to the CEO, which I think are so accurate. One is understanding the nomenclature on both sides of the equation, by the way. You need to understand how to speak a technology speak, and technologists need to understand how to speak a business speak. And if you have to, send them to class. Get them to learn that because they need to be able to have that conversation. And the second is the way to articulate a vision. it was, it made me think back to the day when we were working off very simple vision statements and you would go off and build. And now all of a sudden that vision is defined at a much more granular level and at a much deeper level. And it needs to be because it's such an important part of the organization, much more important than it was before.
So advice to CEOs from a CEO. I mean, you talk about speaking the same language. You're talking about, and again, some of this to me seems very basic. I just got off a call recently with one of our clients, OC Tanner. For folks that don't know them, they're in the recognition business. They work with their clients to build programs to recognize great work. But every time I talk to them, I learn something. And one of the fundamental things they always go back to is use words like we instead of them. And it sounds so common, but it's so true. You need, as the CEO, to be practicing that within your organization. To what you and Kevin both said, make them understand that we're all a part of this. You don't have to be the one that's solving the problem as the CEO, but you do have to lead the discussion.
And you have to have shared language. You have to have shared language.
Hard to do, though. Easier said than done.
It is, but you make it about shared experiences. To his point, don't fake it. Don't talk about Facebook if you don't have a Facebook account. You may not want to use it a lot, but you need to have it so you understand
Pinterest,
what it
yeah,
means.
whatever the channel.
So that when they say it's on the wall, you know what a wall is. If they say tweet, you don't laugh and say, what's tweet mean? You understand what it is that you're talking about, so you at least have enough knowledge to be able to converse in a way that people will respect you and people will understand you. And then they come together, and then they're much more supportive.
So to do that, to take what Kevin said, bridging his mentality, his methodology with Imagistic, bridging business and technology, one final comment about that. Do you agree with fundamentally starting with the business principles when you're dealing with a client like that or dealing with your own organization?
I think it's critical because it's all about, you now can measure. You can now measure effectiveness, and you don't need to throw it all over the wall, hope that it works, and then pray that what you get back is what you wanted. It's much more of an integrated process. It's much more of a fluid process. So now all of a sudden you can make it part of your business management, and you can come to the table. It's almost, I was talking to someone the other day, and he made the comment, there's very little that's insurmountable. It's a question of how you do it. And in a lot of ways, that's what it's become. For a CEO who says, I wish that we could do this, chances are it's doable. It's just a question of how you want to get it done.
Our guest has been Kevin Howard Goldberg on this edition of CEO Corner. Kevin Howard Goldberg is the president of Imagistic. Check them out at Imagistic.com. For Stephen Saber, I'm Butch Stearns. Thanks for being a part of CEO Corner. Check out all our original content at the Pulse Network, thepulsenetwork.com. We'll see you next time on CEO Corner.